Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the noise of the day and climbing into the clouds, where legends were whispered and thunder was never just weather. This isn't your usual bedtime story. Tonight, it's Greek mythology raw, unpredictable, and a little messier than the marble statues would ever let on. Think about it. We all grew up hearing that the gods of Olympus were perfect, immortal, flawless, shining examples carved in stone. But if you pull back the curtain, you'll find something closer to a dysfunctional family drama than a heavenly council. Picture 12 immortals packed into a mountaintop penthouse, drinking, plotting, arguing, and yes, sometimes falling apart in ways that feel surprisingly human. That's where we're heading tonight, because the truth is, these stories weren't built to make you feel small under the stars. They were built to remind you that even gods carried flaws, doubts, and grudges. And when you're lying there in the dark, maybe restless, maybe fighting off another sleepless night, there's something oddly comforting about that. It's like realizing that even the mighty tripped over their own egos and still managed to leave a legacy that echoes thousands of years later. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Mount Olympus rises out of the haze like a fortress of clouds and stone, the kind of place you can't climb with ropes or trail maps. To the Greeks, it wasn't just a mountain, it was a threshold. Down below, mortals sweated, prayed, fought, and died. Up here the air shimmered with nectar, gossip, and the sound of immortality arguing over who left their harp out in the rain. Imagine stepping into the grand hall at twilight. The marble glows honey gold, the light bending across pillars so tall they look like frozen lightning bolts. Tables stretch the length of football fields, groaning with fruit that never rots, cheese aged by prophecy itself, and goblets overflowing with wine strong enough to drown your regrets. Somewhere, Apollo's strumming his lyre, showing off again. Across the hall, Ares is already sulking because someone accused him of breaking another chair. It's not exactly the choir of angels vibe you'd expect from the gods. That's the thing, Olympus wasn't a temple of peace. It was a cosmic dinner party that never ended. And like every long dinner party, someone was always storming out, slamming the door made of clouds behind them, swearing they'd never come back. Spoiler, they always came back. Think of the last family holiday gathering you survived. Now crank the stakes up to immortal, throw in weapons of mass destruction, and make every grudge eternal. That's Olympus. The poets never gave us blueprints. Homer and Hesiod described radiant halls and cloud gates, but left the details fuzzy, probably on purpose. Maybe Olympus wasn't a place you could sketch on a map. Maybe it was meant to be felt, bronze and gold, music echoing like thunder softened in velvet, and a constant tension, like the mountain itself might split if two gods glared at each other for too long. And make no mistake, they glared often. Each Olympian carried a portfolio, like some divine job title they never asked for but kept anyway. Zeus held thunder and law, but also a suspicious knack for slipping out of meetings. Hera guarded marriage and dignity, though her patience had an expiration date. Poseidon ran the seas and earthquakes, which made his mood swings extra dangerous. Athena had wisdom and strategy, the kind that could turn a whole war with one sentence. Hermes delivered messages and lies in equal measure. Dionysus well. He handled the drinking, and let's just say he thrived in that department. But having portfolios didn't mean they behaved like professionals. No, the gods meddled. They butted into mortal lives the way neighbours butt into your backyard barbecue uninvited, loud, and usually leaving a mess behind. To the Greeks, this wasn't a flaw. It was a truth the world was chaotic, unfair, and inconsistent. So naturally, its rulers were too. And yet, Olympus wasn't only chaos. It was also the pause after a storm, the glow of sunlight returning after lightning scorched the hills. For every outburst, there was stillness. For every rivalry, there was a strange kind of bond. Think about it, you don't fight that hard with someone unless you care, even if it's twisted. Olympus was dysfunctional, yes, but it was also home. What makes this fascinating and why this story has lasted 3,000 years is that the gods weren't written as perfect ideals. They were mirrors, They were us, stretched to divine scale. Our jealousies, our pride, our stubbornness, our flashes of brilliance and tenderness, all magnified until they shook the heavens. And here's the paradox that makes Olympus such a perfect bedtime story. Realizing that even God stumbled somehow makes it easier to rest. If the mighty could be petty, if the immortal could be insecure, maybe our own flaws aren't such monsters after all. Maybe we can close our eyes knowing that the world has always been messy, but life goes on. So tonight, that's the journey we're taking. We're not just naming gods and listing their powers, we're stepping into their halls, listening to their whispers, feeling the heat of their arguments, and maybe, just maybe, finding pieces of ourselves among them. The story of Olympus doesn't begin with marble halls or feasts of ambrosia. It begins in darkness, with a father so afraid of his children that he swallowed them whole. Cronus, the Titan king, sat on his throne convinced that every cry from a newborn was a dagger aimed at his heart. Prophecy had warned him one of his sons would rise against him, and so, when each child was born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon Cronus snatched them up, swallowed them like bitter pills, and pretended that silence meant safety. It's one of those moments in mythology where you stop and think, this is less about gods and more about every parent who fears being replaced. Cronus wasn't just paranoid, he was the embodiment of power that can't imagine its own end. That paranoia is timeless. It's the same boardroom executive who clings to their seat, the same empire that crushes dissent, the same ruler who thinks exile and execution will keep them immortal. But paranoia never sleeps easy. Rhea, their mother, was caught in the middle queen beside a tyrant, yet mother to children whose cries she could no longer hear. How do you live with that? Do you pretend they never existed? Or do you swallow your rage and plot in silence? Rhea chose the latter. When her youngest, Zeus, was born, she couldn't bear to lose another child. So she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and handed it to Cronus. The Titan king gulped it down without question. Rhea's deception gave Zeus a chance. Tucked away on the island of Crete, hidden in a cave, nursed by a goat with milk as strong as wine, and guarded by warriors who clashed their spears so loudly they drowned out his infant cries. Imagine that nursery, not pastel walls or lullabies, but steel on steel, the air shaking with the sound of war before the child could even stand. Zeus was raised with noise and secrecy, his cradle less a bed and more a battle drum. From the start, his lullaby was the clash of metal. When Zeus came of age, he didn't just inherit a prophecy, he embodied it. He returned not as a frightened boy, but as a storm wrapped in flesh. With cunning, he tricked Cronus into vomiting up his siblings. And what spilled out wasn't just family, it was fury that had been buried alive. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, all reborn, gasping, furious at the years stolen from them. Can you picture that moment? 6 gods, fully grown, stepping out of their father's stomach like shadows unleashed. That's not just myth, that's trauma given form. And from that trauma came war. Not a battle that lasted an afternoon, not even a campaign that dragged through winter and spring. The Titanomachy raged for 10 long years. Imagine a decade where the skies burned with the lightning, the seas split under tridents, the earth cracked open, and mountains themselves turned into weapons. On one side, the Titans, old gods clinging to the world they had carved. On the other, the Olympians, younger, hungrier, armed with the fury of being devoured and denied. It wasn't a clean war. Every clash was personal. Cronus hurled whole ranges of stone at his children. Poseidon struck the ground and sent waves to drown his father's allies. Hades carried a helmet that cloaked him in shadow, slipping through the battlefield unseen, turning fear itself into a weapon. Hera and Demeter called upon the raw forces of fertility and vengeance, twisting the natural world against the old order, and Zeus, high above, flung thunderbolts so bright they split the night into day. But for all their power, the war was a stalemate. Titans were immense, brutal, and unyielding. Every time an Olympian struck, a Titan answered with a force that shook valleys apart. Mortals down below told stories of earthquakes, floods, wildfires, and wondered what crime they had committed to deserve such wrath. For 10 years, the world itself was the collateral damage of a family feud. Here's the part most myths rush through, but it's worth pausing on 10 years of war means 10 years of exhaustion. 10 years of brothers and sisters wondering if the prophecy was worth the blood. 10 years where even gods questioned whether victory would taste like freedom or just another form of chains. War isn't glorious when it drags that long. It corrodes, it weighs, it whispers doubts into the strongest heart. The turning point came not from Zeus alone, but from an unlikely ally. The Olympians freed the Cyclops and the Hecaton Chiras, the 100-handed giants, from their prisons. Outcasts, forgotten, shoved aside by the Titans. They carried a grudge as heavy as the earth itself. The Cyclops forged weapons, thunderbolts for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, a helm of invisibility for Hades, tools not just of war, but of transformation. The 100-handed, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, hurled boulders the size of mountains, battering Titan defences until even Cronus flinched. With these allies, the balance shifted. Zeus hurled bolt after bolt, the sky lit with fire so fierce it seared the horizon. Poseidon shattered cliffs with his trident, seas roaring like beasts unchained. Hades slipped unseen, turning Titan generals against one another with whispers of doom, and together, for the first time, the siblings fought not as victims but as gods in their own right. Cronus fell, not in silence, but in a roar that echoed down the generations. The Titans were cast into Tartarus, chained in a pit so deep that mortals said an anvil would fall for 9 days before reaching the bottom. Victory belonged to the Olympians, but triumph is never clean. When the smoke cleared, the world was scarred, forests burned, rivers poisoned, whole lands reshaped, and standing at the summit was Zeus, crowned not by choice but by inevitability. This is the seed of Olympus, not glory, not peace, but survival. A family that rose from their father's stomach and carved their empire in fire and ash. And this is where the psychology of the gods begins. Every victory is shadowed by the fear of betrayal. Zeus ruled, yes, but he ruled with the memory of Cronus in his veins. Hera carried her dignity, but also the humiliation of chains. Poseidon wielded his trident, but never forgot the taste of being swallowed. Hades held dominion over the underworld, but carried the silence of centuries in his chest. That's the secret under the marble and gold. Olympus wasn't built on perfection. It was built on trauma, stitched together by siblings who had survived their father's hunger. That's why their family drama feels so human. Because beneath the thunderbolts and crowns, they were still children who'd been devoured and who swore never to be powerless again. And if you've ever felt swallowed by something bigger than you, by fear, by work, by loneliness, then maybe you understand why this story still lingers. It's not about gods in the clouds. It's about fighting your way back into the light, even if it takes 10 years, even if the world shakes while you climb. Zeus stood at the summit of Olympus, smoke still curling from the battlefield below, and for the first time he felt the weight of victory press against his shoulders. The Titans had fallen, his father chained in the abyss, his siblings free, yet triumph didn't feel like freedom. It felt like responsibility, the kind that gnaws at you in the quiet moments. When the storm has passed and there's no one left to fight but yourself, the Greeks painted him as the Almighty, the Thunder Wielder, the unquestioned king. But beneath the thunder, Zeus was something messier, a man terrified of becoming his father. Cronus had ruled with fear, swallowing every child before they could grow strong enough to challenge him. Zeus had overthrown that tyranny, yes, but the prophecy lingered like a shadow. If Cronus could fall, so could he. Kingship is rarely about comfort. It's about paranoia dressed in robes of gold. On his throne, Zeus could command the skies, order the rains, split the heavens with a glance. Mortals prayed to him not because they loved him, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't. If a promise was broken, it was Zeus they dreaded. If a stranger appeared at their door, they offered bread and wine in his name, hoping he'd see their hospitality and spare them misfortune. He was the glue that held society together, but glue hardens with time, and sometimes it cracks. What set Zeus apart wasn't just his thunderbolts. It was his ability to weave law into fear, to make oaths sacred, to make betrayal feel like treason against the universe itself. And yet, for all his divine authority, he couldn't hold his own household in order. That irony hung over him like a storm cloud. Zeus's personal life was a gallery of scandals. His desire was endless, and so were the disguises he used to pursue it. A swan drifting across a river, a bull with eyes too human, a shower of golden light seeping into a locked chamber. He was creativity wrapped in hunger. Some saw these liaisons as abuses of power, others as myths explaining why heroes bore the spark of divinity. But at their core, they reveal a restless king. Zeus sought intimacy not out of love alone, but out of an obsession with legacy. Every child born of his unions was another anchor against the fear of fading, another stitch in the tapestry of his reign. Heracles, Perseus, Helen, Minos heroes, whose names endured as extensions of his own. And here's the tragic part: the more children he fathered, the more enemies he created. For every new hero, there was a wife betrayed, a goddess scorned, a mortal family torn apart. The Olympian court was less a council and more a soap opera, every feast ripe with side glances and whispered curses. Hera, his queen, carried her rage like a crown, plotting vengeance not only on him but on the children who bore his resemblance. To rule the heavens and tremble in your marriage, that was Zeus's contradiction. Still, for all his failings, Zeus was more than a reckless lover. He was also a judge. When mortals grew arrogant, when kings claimed to be his equal, Zeus was swift to remind them otherwise. Lightning struck towers, earthquakes swallowed armies, floods erased cities. But justice wasn't always cruel. Those who honoured their oaths, who welcomed strangers, who sacrificed in reverence, he rewarded them with rain for their fields, victories in battle, or the simple mercy of survival. Zeus wasn't consistent, but he was watchful. The world spun under his gaze, and every act, noble or wicked, carried the chance of catching his eye. One of his most telling moments came in the story of Prometheus. The Titan had defied him, stealing fire from the heavens and gifting it to mankind. Fire was more than warmth. It was progress, freedom, danger. It gave mortals the means to rise beyond their place. For that theft, Zeus chained Prometheus to a rock where an eagle tore at his liver every day. It was punishment, but also a reminder gifts from the gods always came with a price. And yet, centuries later, Zeus forgave him. Why, maybe even a king tires of vengeance. Or maybe he saw in Prometheus the same defiance that had once burned in himself. Zeus was unpredictable because life was unpredictable. Crops failed, storms rose, wars broke out without warning. To the Greeks, the god above had to be as fickle as the world they lived in. If he were too rational, too fair, he'd be unbelievable. Instead, Zeus was a storm with a mind, a father who roared, a ruler who laughed one day and struck the next. That was his power, to embody the chaos and still stand as its center. And yet, for all the grandeur, there was something almost human in the way he carried himself. Picture him at a feast, goblet in hand, laughter shaking the walls, but his eyes always scanning the room, counting loyalties, measuring betrayals, weighing who might one day rise against him. He had seen his father fall. He knew immortality didn't guarantee safety. Power was never secure, it had to be defended, again and again, until eternity itself grew weary. This is why Zeus feels so familiar, even now. Strip away the thunderbolts, and you see the portrait of every leader haunted by insecurity, the CEO who fears the new intern will rise too quickly, the president who silences dissent, the patriarch who clings to authority while his family fractures around him. Zeus wasn't just the king of gods. He was the embodiment of the human fear of being replaced. But there's another side. He could also be merciful. When a city honored him with temples, when prayers rose with sincerity, he answered. When a hero stumbled under the weight of fate, Zeus sometimes tilted the scales just enough to let them stand again. He was both storm and shelter, punishment and protection. That contradiction is what kept the Greeks returning to him, telling and retelling his stories, because in their chaos, they recognized their own. Even his image told a story. At Olympia, a colossal statue of gold and ivory depicted him seated, scepter in hand, calm and immovable. It was counted among the 7 wonders of the world, not just for its beauty, but for the reassurance it offered. To stand before it was to believe that somewhere above the noise and suffering, There was order, however fragile, however flawed. Yet behind that serene image was the man who argued with Hera, who disguised himself to seduce mortals, who feared the rise of his own sons. That duality is why Zeus endures. He was never simply a tyrant or a hero. He was both. He was the storm and the calm after, the law and the transgressor, the king and the father fumbling to keep his house from burning, and maybe that's why his reign lasted. Not because he was perfect, but because he was believable. A god too perfect would have faded. A god too cruel would have been abandoned. Zeus survived because he mirrored the world, terrifying, inconsistent, magnificent, and, in moments of silence, weary. So when thunder rumbles far away, rolling across the sky like a drumbeat, maybe it's not just weather. Maybe it's the sound of a king still watching, still weighing, still trying to hold together a family and a cosmos that was never meant to be quiet. And in that sound, we catch a glimpse of ourselves, our hunger for control, our fear of loss, our fragile hope that order, even for a moment, might hold. If Zeus was the thunder, Hera was the echo that refused to be drowned out. She sat beside him on Olympus, queen in name and in presence, the goddess of marriage, women, and dignity. But her throne was never comfortable. Every smile at the banquets, every toast raised in her honor, was shadowed by the knowledge that her husband's eyes and footsteps wandered endlessly. Hera is too often painted as just the jealous wife. That's the shallow version. The deeper truth is that she was a strategist, a politician, a survivor in a palace where betrayal was routine. Marriage, to her, wasn't a romantic covenant. It was law. It was the spine of order, the glue that kept gods and mortals alike from spinning into chaos. And every time Zeus broke that bond, Hera wasn't just insulted, she was undermined. Her fury wasn't simply jealousy. It was the rage of a queen who saw her authority chipped away, one tryst at a time. The Greeks told stories of her vengeance. Io, transformed into a heifer and hounded across the earth by a gadfly. Semele, tricked into demanding to see Zeus's true form and burned to ash by divine fire. Heracles, tormented at every turn. Not for his own sins, but because of who his father was. These aren't just cruel punishments. They're examples of Hera trying to enforce order when her partner had made a mockery of it. She was punishing Zeus by proxy, striking where it hurt most his offspring. But there's another story, one often brushed aside, that reveals the steel beneath her crown. Once, Hera grew so weary of Zeus's arrogance that she plotted with Poseidon, Athena, and others to overthrow him. They drugged him, bound him in unbreakable chains, and mocked his thunder as he thrashed helplessly. For a moment, she was no longer just the queen beside the king, she was the architect of rebellion. It failed, of course. The 100-handed giant Briareus freed Zeus, and his wrath scorched the rebellion to ashes. Hera was punished, hung from the heavens with golden shackles, a weight tied to her ankles so she dangled in humiliation. The gods looked on. No one dared intervene. Picture that the goddess of dignity suspended in the sky, her cries echoing across the world. To mortals, it must have seemed like the universe itself was broken. But humiliation, in Hera's hands, didn't remain defeat. She endured. She came down from those chains more relentless than before, her dignity scarred but sharpened. If Zeus embodied fear of losing power, Hera embodied the resilience of reclaiming it. She ruled not just with vengeance, but with symbols. The peacock, her sacred bird, carried 100 eyes on its tail, reminders of Argus, the watchman she once commanded. Those eyes, gleaming like jewels, became the emblem of her vigilance. She could not stop Zeus from straying, but she could watch. She could remember. She could never forget. The pomegranate, heavy with seeds, stood for fertility and marriage, the cycle of renewal that even Zeus's betrayals couldn't undo. In her temples, women prayed not just for fidelity, but for strength. Marriage in ancient Greece wasn't soft or romantic, it was survival, alliance, the merging of households and fortunes. Hera's worshippers knew that, and they saw in her not weakness but solidarity. She was the goddess who understood that dignity had to be fought for, that endurance was sacred. Her relationship with Heracles is a perfect lens into this complexity. He was Zeus's son by another woman, born a living reminder of her humiliation. Hera hounded him with madness, driving him to kill his own family. It's one of the darkest episodes in myth, one that makes her look cruel. But look closer, Heracles' eventual labours, his suffering, his redemption, all stem from that madness, in a strange way. Hera was part of his making. She became his antagonist, yes, but also the whetstone that honed him into legend. Heroes are often forged not by love, but by struggle, and Hera was the force that refused to let him rest. It's tempting to dismiss her as bitter, but bitterness doesn't build temples, and Hera's temples dotted the ancient world, grand sanctuaries where women gathered to honour her strength. The Herion at Samos, the great sanctuary at Argos, these were not shrines to a caricature of jealousy. They were monuments to endurance. Her worshippers weren't naive. They knew marriage could be cruel, humiliating, unfair. Hera was their reminder that even when vows were broken, dignity could survive, even triumph. In many ways, Hera's story is more human than Zeus's. We don't all wield thunderbolts, but we all know the sting of betrayal, the weight of humiliation, the slow grind of carrying on anyway. Hera's vengeance was sharp, but her resilience was sharper. She didn't vanish into despair. She stood taller, even if her stance was rigid with anger. There's a haunting beauty in the image of her chained to the sky. Every time she looked down, she must have seen mortals struggling through their own humiliations, their own compromises, and maybe, in some unspoken way, they saw her too not as a flawless queen, but as a companion in their endurance. The irony of Hera is that she was both victim and victor. She couldn't stop Zeus from betraying her, but she could make sure his betrayals echoed with consequences. She couldn't rewrite the law of Olympus, but she could embody the law's unyielding spirit. She couldn't always win, but she never bowed. And perhaps that's why her presence still lingers. The Greeks knew that power without opposition curdles into tyranny. Zeus may have ruled with thunder, but Hera ruled with memory. He struck quickly, she struck slowly, but her blows lasted. He feared betrayal, she feared erasure. Together, they formed a balance volatile enough to shake the heavens, but a balance nonetheless. So when you think of Hera, don't just imagine a jealous wife chasing Zeus's lovers. Imagine a queen who once dared to overthrow her king. Imagine her hanging from chains and still returning to the throne. Imagine the peacock's eyes, gleaming with vigilance, every feather a reminder that nothing goes unseen. She was dignity personified, sharpened by rage, hardened by humiliation, yet unbroken. And in that, maybe she reflects something we all carry, the stubborn will to endure slights, betrayals, losses, and still stand. Not because it's fair, but because standing is all there is. Hera reminds us that even in chains, you can keep your crown. Poseidon's throne was never in the clouds. His power rolled beneath the surface, hidden in the deep, a kingdom of salt and silence that stretched farther than Olympus ever could. He was the second son of Cronus, the brother who survived the swallowing, the warrior who fought shoulder to shoulder in the Titanomachy. But once the war ended and the world was divided, he drew the lot of the sea. Zeus claimed the sky, Hades took the underworld, and Poseidon was left with the water. At first glance, it seemed fair. In reality, it was a wound he never let heal. The sea is endless, yes, but it's also a prison of horizons. To Zeus, Poseidon's realm was always down there, a restless expanse that could never match the majesty of the open heavens. Poseidon carried that chip on his shoulder for eternity. Every thunderclap above reminded him that his younger brother had taken the loftier crown, and resentment, when mixed with power, becomes dangerous. Poseidon ruled with moods as shifting as the tides. Sailors prayed to him before voyages, tossing horses into the surf as sacrifices, begging for calm seas. Farmers in coastal towns cursed his name when storms ripped apart their crops. He could be generous, guiding ships safely to port, or merciless, summoning waves high enough to swallow fleets. To mortals, he was as unpredictable as the ocean itself. That unpredictability was no accident, it was Poseidon's personality made flesh. One of his most bitter defeats came on land, in the contest for Athens. He struck the ground with his trident, and from the earth gushed a spring of salt water, a gift to prove his worth as the city's patron. Athena followed, planting a simple olive tree, Where Poseidon's spring was briny and undrinkable, her tree offered fruit, oil, wood, a legacy of survival. The people chose her. The goddess of wisdom triumphed, and the god of the sea was left humiliated. From that moment on, Poseidon carried a grudge not just against Athena, but against the Athenians themselves. His punishment was not swift, but it was relentless. He battered their ships, plagued their coasts, and reminded them that spurning him came with a cost. But Poseidon's fury wasn't reserved for Athens alone. He despised the Trojans after their king Laomedon cheated him. Together with Apollo, Poseidon had been forced to labour for Laomedon, building the great walls of Troy. When their work was finished, the king refused to pay. A mortal king defrauding gods, it was a humiliation Poseidon never forgave. When the Trojan War came generations later, Poseidon's bitterness seeped into the conflict. Every crash of the sea against Troy's shores was his vengeance echoing through time. Even among mortals, Poseidon's relationships reflected his volatility. He fathered heroes and monsters alike, Theseus, the great Athenian, and Polyphemus, the Cyclops blinded by Odysseus. Each child was a fragment of his dual nature, heroic potential and terrifying wrath. His sons became his legacy, but also his reminders that he straddled the line between creation and destruction. Perhaps no story captures Poseidon's grudge better than Odysseus's long voyage home. After the Trojan War, Odysseus blinded Polyphemus, Poseidon's son. That single act condemned him. For 10 years, Poseidon blocked his return, scattering him across the seas, breaking ships, drowning companions, twisting fate until Ithaca seemed like a mirage. Odysseus' suffering wasn't just a punishment, it was Poseidon's pride made manifest. The god could forgive many things, but not an insult to his blood. What makes Poseidon compelling is that he wasn't entirely monstrous. Sailors adored him when the winds were favourable, when the sea gleamed like glass and the stars guided them home. He was also the god of horses, a symbol of speed, strength, and beauty. In the pounding hooves of a stallion, in the spray of surf along its flanks, mortals saw Poseidon's gift. He was chaos, yes, but also motion, vitality, the force that kept the world restless. Without him, the seas would stagnate, the world would fall silent. Still, he was never at peace, unlike Hades, who ruled his underworld with grim acceptance. Poseidon seethed. Every defeat, every slight, every reminder of Zeus's supremacy gnawed at him. He wanted more than waves and tridents. He wanted acknowledgement, a crown to match his power. That longing made him dangerous, because a god who feels undervalued will prove his worth through destruction. The Greeks built temples to calm him, not to celebrate him. At the Isthmus of Corinth, they razed the sanctuary of Izmir, offering sacrifices to keep his anger at bay. They honoured him not out of love, but out of fear, the fear of storms, earthquakes, and floods that could erase entire villages overnight. And Poseidon seemed to relish it. Fear was as binding as devotion. In some ways, it was better. Imagine him in his palace beneath the waves, coral walls shimmering, schools of fish swirling like courtiers. On his throne, he must have felt both kingly and caged, surrounded by beauty but haunted by envy. Above, Zeus's thunder rolled. Below, Poseidon clenched his trident, each crash of surf a reminder of what he could never fully claim. His heart was as restless as the sea he ruled, and perhaps that's why mortals feared him most. Storms end, even Zeus's thunder passes, but the sea is always there, endless, horizon after horizon, waiting for the moment to rise. Poseidon didn't need to strike often. The threat of him was enough. Sailors whispered his name before they set sail, knowing one wrong step could mean disaster. His presence lingered in every tide, every shifting current, every wave that slammed against the rocks. Poseidon was the embodiment of resentment turned into power. He could create beauty, but he chose often to remind the world of his rage. He could bless cities, but he preferred to break those who crossed him. He was the brother who never forgot that his lot had been second best, that his realm was water while another ruled the sky. And yet, for all his fury, Poseidon's stories endure because they reflect something raw, who hasn't felt overlooked. who hasn't carried the sting of losing, of being passed over for someone else. Poseidon is that wound carved into godhood. He is the storm that rages when pride is bruised, the earthquake that shouts when silence becomes unbearable. He is the part of us that refuses to forgive, that waits years, decades, centuries to strike back. That's why he lingers in the imagination. Because he's not just a god of the sea, he's the god of the grudges we keep, the tempests we carry, the waves we unleash when our pride can't stay buried any longer. And when you hear the surf pound against the cliffs, when the tide roars louder than the wind, maybe it's not just the ocean speaking. Maybe it's Poseidon, still reminding the world that he was more than water, more than second best, that he was power, and he demanded to be feared. If Poseidon's rage was loud and crashing, Hades' power was the silence that followed. He didn't rule from the sky or the sea. His domain stretched beneath the earth, a vast shadowy kingdom that every soul, king or beggar, would eventually enter. He didn't have to seek worship. He didn't demand loyalty. Time itself delivered his subjects to his gates. When the lots were drawn after the Titanomachy, Hades' brothers took the places of glory, the sky and the sea, realms alive with motion and spectacle. Hades descended instead into a place that smelled of ash and memory, where no sunlight broke the horizon. And yet, he accepted it. He didn't rage like Poseidon, didn't strut like Zeus. He simply claimed what was his and built order out of death. The Greeks feared him, yes, but they also respected him. They didn't carve endless temples for him, didn't sing his name in festivals. His presence was too heavy for celebration, but when they buried their dead, when they whispered prayers at the grave, it was to him they turned. Hades wasn't death itself, that role belonged to Thanatos. Hades was what came after, the structure, the law, the inevitability. Picture the underworld, 5 rivers carving paths through darkness, the Styx, where oaths unbroken gained their power, the Acheron, a river of pain, Cocytus, river of lament, Phlegethon, river of fire, Lethe, river of forgetfulness. Each one carried more than water, they carried the weight of human fear, sorrow, and release. And at the threshold stood Charon, the ferryman, waiting for his coin. Those who were buried without rites wandered as restless shades, unable to cross, forever stuck in a limbo of neglect. In that detail alone, you can hear the ancient dread not being remembered was worse than dying. Within his halls, Hades ruled with a quiet discipline. He was no tyrant. He didn't lash out like his brothers, didn't hurl storms or bolts. His power was steadiness. The souls of the wicked were punished. The just were rewarded. Most drifted in shadowy meadows of forgettable rest. Judges like Minos, Rhadamanthes, and Aeacus weighed the dead, but all of it existed under Hades' watch. He didn't interfere with the living unless provoked, and when provoked, his fury was cold, merciless, and absolute. One of the rare times he stepped into myth's spotlight was with Persephone. He took her as his queen, carrying her into the underworld. To some, it was an abduction. To others, a marriage forged by inevitability. Demeter's grief froze the earth. Crops withered, and mankind starved until the bargain was struck. Persephone would split her time, half in the underworld, half above. That story gave the world its seasons, but it also gave Hades something else, companionship in a realm, otherwise void of warmth. He wasn't Zeus with countless affairs. He wasn't Poseidon scattering seed across coastlines. Hades was monogamous, bound to Persephone with a strange loyalty. Dark though the tale may be, it painted him as more steadfast than either brother. And maybe that's why Hades has always felt different. Zeus and Poseidon craved recognition, fought for worship, demanded shrines. Hades didn't care for the noise. His realm didn't need temples because no one could escape him. He was the only god who could say with certainty, everyone comes to me in the end. There's a strange dignity in that. The dignity of inevitability. Mortals imagined his crown not of gold but of iron, heavy and plain. They pictured him seated on an ebony throne, surrounded by asphodel fields where millions of souls drifted like autumn leaves. He had a helm of invisibility, not for intimidation but for subtlety. He could move unseen, strike unseen, and remind even gods that power didn't need to roar to be felt. The fear of Hades wasn't fear of cruelty. It was fear of silence. Think of walking into a room where 1,000 voices had just been speaking, and suddenly all of them fall quiet at once. That hush, heavy and endless, was Hades's presence. The Greeks didn't want to speak his name casually, because to invoke him was to invite the thought of death into the room. They called him Pluton, the wealthy one, because the riches of the earth, gold, silver, fertile soil lay beneath his feet. In that, he was prosperity as much as he was decay. Even the gods treated him with caution. They meddled in mortal lives, yes, but few dared meddle in his. His realm was sacred ground, a line not easily crossed. Heroes who dared Orpheus, Theseus, Heracles entered at great cost, and each left changed, scarred by the weight of what they saw. No one returned from Hades unchanged. That's his gift, or his curse to remind the living that they're fragile, temporary, fleeting. And that's what makes Hades oddly comforting. In a world of chaos, thunder, storms, wars, jealousies, he was consistency. Death was cruel, but it was fair. It came for everyone, rich or poor, king or peasant. Hades didn't pick favourites, didn't play politics with fate. He ruled with a cold equality that Zeus could never match. In that way, he was almost merciful. Imagine a life of constant struggle, hunger, fear of tyrants. To enter Hades's realm was to finally rest, to finally drop the burden. Yes, there were punishments for the wicked. Yes, there were meadows of forgetfulness. But for most, there was relief, a quiet field where you could stop running. The Greeks, who knew suffering well, found solace in that. They didn't love him, but they respected him. He was not their enemy. He was their end. To fear him was to fear the inevitable, and in time, even fear softens. So while Zeus crackled in the sky and Poseidon roared in the sea, Hades kept watch below. He didn't need to be flashy. He didn't need adoration. His strength was patience. And in that patience lies a truth that mortals and gods alike could never escape. Everything ends. Empires crumble, thrones topple, temples fall to dust. But Hades remains, steady as the grave, and maybe that's the secret comfort of his story. When the noise of the world grows too loud, when storms batter us, when betrayals cut deep, there's something strangely soothing in knowing that one day the noise will fade. That silence waits, not as an enemy, but as a constant. Hades doesn't promise joy or glory. He promises rest. Athena was born in a way that even the gods found unsettling. Zeus had swallowed her mother Metis, fearing a prophecy that a child of hers might one day surpass him. For months he carried the weight of that decision in his body, until one day a piercing headache split his skull. From that wound leapt Athena fully grown, armoured, her grey eyes flashing like sharpened steel. She was the only child Zeus could never deny, because she came not from union or affair, but from his very mind. She was thought made flesh, strategy given form. From the beginning, she was unlike the others. She didn't chase affairs, didn't hunger for recognition through children or conquests of the flesh. Her power was clarity. Mortals called her Pallas Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and crafts. She carried a shield, the Aegis, fringed with snakes and the terrifying face of the Gorgon. She stood in contrast to Ares, her half-brother, who revelled in blood and chaos. Where he rushed blindly into battle, she paused, considered, calculated. Her wars were won before the first spear left a soldier's hand. Athena's mind wasn't cold, but it was precise. She was the goddess of the olive tree, a gift she offered to Athens in her contest with Poseidon. It wasn't flashy like his salt spring. It was practical wood for fire, oil for lamps, fruit for sustenance. It was the kind of gift that endures, that sustains generations. And so Athens chose her, crowning her as their patron goddess. The city carried her name, and for centuries it thrived under her legacy of reason and resilience. But wisdom has its shadows, and Athena carried those too. One of the darkest tales linked to her was the story of Medusa. Medusa had once been a maiden in Athena's temple, sacred ground meant for purity and devotion. When Poseidon violated her there, Athena didn't strike Poseidon, no one struck Poseidon without consequence. Instead, she turned Medusa into a monster, hair coiling into serpents. gaze cursed to stone. To many, it seemed cruel, unjust. Why punish the victim? But Athena was less about compassion than about control. She couldn't allow her temple to become a symbol of violation unanswered. In her mind, Medusa's curse was a weapon, a warning, a way of transforming desecration into power. Yet it left a scar on her image, one that makes her both revered and feared. Her relationships with mortals were always marked by this duality. She was a patron of heroes, yes, but she demanded they earn her favour. Odysseus, wily and clever, was her favourite child among men. She whispered strategy into his ear, guided his ship through storms, and taught him that cunning could triumph where brute force failed. Perseus carried her shield when he slew Medusa, turning the Gorgon's curse into his salvation. She wasn't a soft hand or a gentle embrace. She was the voice that says, think, wait, strike only when the moment is right. Yet, like all the Olympians, Athena wasn't immune to pride. When Arachne, a mortal weaver, claimed her skill surpassed the goddess's own, Athena disguised herself as an old woman and challenged her to a contest. Arachne's tapestry was flawless, perhaps even more beautiful than Athena's, but it depicted the gods in all their scandals, their betrayals, their humiliations. Athena's fury ignited not just at being challenged, but at being exposed. She struck Arachne down, transforming her into a spider, cursed to weave forever in silence. It was both punishment and acknowledgement Arachne's art lived on, eternal. But so did her submission. Athena's strength was in discipline. She never allowed passion to overrule judgment, never let chaos dictate her hand. In a pantheon defined by excess, she was restraint incarnate, but restraint comes with a price. Compassion is often sacrificed on the altar of order. Athena's wisdom was brilliant, but it could also be merciless. To the Athenians, she was more than a goddess. She was their ideal. The Parthenon rose in her honour, its columns gleaming in the sun, a monument to reason and proportion. Festivals like the Panathenaea celebrated her, not with drunken revels like Dionysus, but with processions, sacrifices, and contests of intellect and skill. She was the spirit of the city itself, a reminder that civilization could rise above chaos if guided by discipline. But the shadow of Medusa lingered, as did the threads of Arachne. These stories remind us that intellect isn't free from cruelty, that sometimes wisdom is wielded like a blade, cutting away weakness without considering the wound it leaves. Athena was the promise of clarity, but clarity without mercy can be colder than any storm. Still, mortals adored her. They saw in her the possibility of justice, of victory through cunning rather than bloodshed. When generals prayed before battle, they asked not for Ares' rage, but for Athena's guidance. When artisans wove cloth, carved statues, or forged tools, they invoked her name. She was present in every careful decision, every strategy whispered before dawn, every hand steady enough to shape raw material into something enduring. Imagine her standing at the edge of a battlefield, cloak whipping in the wind, shield raised high, not rushing into the fray but watching, analysing, calculating the pivot that would decide the war. Imagine her eyes, cool and unwavering, seeing not just the clash before her but the generations that would rise or fall because of it. That was Athena, the long view, the discipline to endure impatience, the clarity to turn chaos into pattern. And in that, she speaks to us even now, in a world that often glorifies loudness, rashness, spectacle. Athena reminds us of the power of restraint, of the sharp edge of thought. She is not comfort, but she is strength. She is not love, but she is survival. She is the voice in the storm that says, wait, plan, and when you strike, strike true. Athena was not flawless. She could be cold, punishing, prideful, but her legacy endured because it was practical, sustainable, real. Olive trees still grow in rocky soil, their roots gripping where others fail. Cities still rise on laws and strategy more than on brute force. Spiders still weave, patient and relentless. These are her gifts, her reminders, her shadows. So when you hear her name, don't picture only the serene goddess carved in marble, helmet gleaming or a spear upright. Picture also the hard eyes that condemned Medusa, the proud hands that struck Arachne, the calculating mind that whispered to Odysseus. Athena was wisdom, yes, but wisdom with an edge, wisdom that cuts as much as it saves. And maybe that's the truest kind, because real wisdom is never gentle, never simple. It is clarity, and clarity often hurts. Apollo arrived on the stage of Olympus with the light of dawn and the arrogance of someone who knew it. Born on the island of Delos, a refuge carved out for his mother Leto after Hera barred her from giving birth anywhere on solid ground. Apollo's first breath was already a declaration of defiance. His twin sister, Artemis, was born just before him, fierce and protective, and together they embodied two sides of a coin sunlight and shadow, civilization and wilderness. Apollo became the god of light, prophecy, music, healing, and ironically, disease. He was beauty sharpened into a weapon, charm that dazzled but also unsettled. Mortals adored him for his gifts, the warmth of the sun, the rhythms of song, the voice of oracles that promised to pierce through the fog of uncertainty. But they also feared him, because the same bow that struck down darkness could just as easily rain plague upon armies, villages, even children. His presence in the Trojan War captures this duality perfectly. When Agamemnon insulted his priest, Apollo didn't storm the battlefield in armor. He stood apart, lifted his bow, and loosed arrows that weren't arrows at all but sickness. Soldiers fell one after another, not pierced through the chest but consumed by fever. Entire ranks crumbled, not from steel but from the invisible hand of disease. In that moment, Apollo wasn't the god of beauty and song. He was contagion itself, a reminder that light can blind, warmth can burn, and music can carry notes of grief. Yet he was also the god of healing. Shrines to Apollo offered remedies, rituals, a chance at renewal. His priests at Delphi and Epidaurus held his name close when mixing herbs, binding wounds, interpreting dreams. It's that contradiction, life and death. Health and sickness that made Apollo so haunting. He wasn't consistent, but then again, neither is the world. Delphi was his crown jewel. High in the mountains, the oracle spoke with his voice, her riddles tangled in smoke and trance. Kings, generals, and commoners alike made the climb, desperate to know their fates. Apollo's answers were never straightforward. They bent like sunlight through water, dazzling but deceptive. Croesus, king of Lydia, once asked if he should march against Persia. The oracle replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Croesus crossed. His empire fell. Apollo didn't lie. He simply left mortals to trip over their own interpretations. That's the thread running through Apollo's myth's brilliance mixed with cruelty. Clarity shadowed by ambiguity. He gave humans glimpses of truth, but never the whole. And maybe that was the point. Too much truth burns. A little mystery keeps the world spinning. But Apollo wasn't just a prophet. He was an artist. The lyre, strung and golden, poured music into the halls of Olympus, calming storms, silencing quarrels, making even the most hardened gods pause to listen. Music, to Apollo, wasn't just entertainment, it was order. It was the universe-given rhythm, chaos reshaped into harmony. In every note, mortals heard reassurance that the world, however cruel, still carried patterns worth clinging to. And yet, like many gods, Apollo's brilliance was tempered by flaws. He fell in love often and badly. Daphne, the nymph who fled his advances, prayed for escape and was transformed into a laurel tree. Apollo crowned himself with her leaves, wearing his failure as a symbol of triumph, but the irony clung to him. Cassandra, the Trojan princess, accepted his gift of prophecy but refused his love. In revenge, he cursed her so that no one would believe her visions. She foresaw Troy's fall, warned her people, screamed the truth and was ignored. Apollo's rejection turned her gift into torment. These are not stories of a benevolent healer, but of a god whose pride burned as hot as his sun. Still, mortals couldn't turn from him. To live under Apollo's gaze was to live under contradiction. He was the warmth that ripened grain and the plague that rotted it. He was the song that soothed a child and the arrow that felled their father. To ignore him was to ignore the sun itself. Impossible and dangerous. Apollo also carried a temper. He once challenged Marsyas, a satyr, to a musical contest. Marsyas played the flute so sweetly that it rivaled Apollo's lyre. When the contest ended, Apollo flayed Marsyas alive, stringing his skin on a tree as a warning. Beauty, in Apollo's world, was his alone to define. Rivalry wasn't art, it was threat. His cruelty in that story is hard to stomach, but it reveals something ancient. Cultures knew that brilliance and brutality often walk hand in hand. But Apollo wasn't all punishment and arrogance. He fathered heroes, inspired poets, healed the sick, guided ships by the constellations he placed in the night sky. He wasn't one note, he was a symphony. He represented the human longing for clarity, order, and beauty, even if those longings are often unmet. Imagine him at Delphi, golden hair catching the mountain light, his eyes both radiant and unreadable. Pilgrims kneel before the oracle, hearts pounding with fear and hope. He gives them riddles, fragments of truth. Some will rise emboldened, others destroyed by misunderstanding. Apollo smiles, not out of malice but out of inevitability. The sun shines on everyone, but not everyone survives the heat. And maybe that's why Apollo resonates so deeply. He is the danger of brilliance, the peril of too much clarity. He reminds us that light is not always kind, that knowledge can wound, that beauty can demand a price. But he also reminds us that without those things, life collapses into darkness. When the Greeks prayed to Apollo, they weren't asking for safety. They were asking for vision, for pattern, for the chance to see just a little further ahead than yesterday. And though he often betrayed them with ambiguity, he gave them something more enduring, the sense that the world, however cruel, still carried meaning. So, as the sun rose each morning, mortals whispered his name, both in gratitude and in fear. Because to live under Apollo was to live under the knowledge that beauty could cut, truth could destroy, and yet without them. Life wasn't worth enduring. If Apollo was the sun that blinded and revealed, Artemis was the moonlight that concealed and protected. She was born just before him, the first twin to touch the world, and even as an infant she was said to have helped deliver her brother. That was her nature from the start, guardian, fierce, untamed. While Apollo embodied reason and civilization, Artemis belonged to the wilderness, to forests alive with shadows and rivers quick with silver light. She was independence carved into divine form. Unlike many of her siblings, Artemis rejected the trappings of Olympus. She didn't sit comfortably at feasts, waiting for nectar to be poured. She wandered the woods, bow in hand, dogs and nymphs at her side, her eyes sharp as any arrow she loosed. She was the goddess of the hunt, of wild creatures, of childbirth, and of the untamed instincts mortals couldn't suppress. If Apollo's temples promised prophecy, Artemis's groves promised raw truth, life and death as nature intended. Without apology, her independence was absolute. She demanded eternal chastity from herself and from the companions who followed her. To mortals, this vow seemed severe, but it wasn't born of disdain. It was her way of carving a life where no man, no god, no husband could claim authority over her. In a pantheon where power was often tangled in seduction, Artemis chose freedom. That freedom was fierce, and she defended it without mercy. The story of Actaeon captures that fierceness. Actaeon, a mortal hunter, stumbled upon Artemis bathing in a secluded spring. He hadn't meant to see her, but his presence was intrusion enough. She didn't hesitate. With a splash of water, she transformed him into a stag. His own hounds, not recognizing their master, tore him apart. To some, it seems cruel. To Artemis, it was justice swift and final. Privacy, dignity, independence were not negotiable. She would kill rather than surrender them. That same fire fueled her role in the Trojan War. When Agamemnon killed a sacred stag, Artemis demanded the ultimate price, the sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia, before the Greek fleet could sail. Some say she snatched the girl away at the last moment, sparing her and substituting a deer. Others say the sacrifice went through. Either way, Artemis reminded mortals that hubris in the wild had consequences. Her justice wasn't abstract, it was visceral, tied to blood and balance. Yet Artemis wasn't only severity, she was also protector. Women in labor called her name, begging for safe passage through the most dangerous threshold of life. Hunters prayed to her for luck, not just for prey, but for survival in the woods. She held a paradox bringer of death, guardian of life. It made her both comforting and terrifying. The moon that both lights the path and hides the wolf. Mortals often found themselves caught in that paradox. Niobe, queen of Thebes, boasted of her many children, mocking Leto, Artemis and Apollo's mother for having only 2. Pride poisoned her words, and the twins answered with arrows. Apollo struck down her sons, Artemis her daughters. The massacre left Niobe a weeping stone on a mountain, her tears flowing forever. It was vengeance. Yes, but also a warning to dishonor their mother was to dishonor them. Artemis's arrows didn't fly for glory. They flew to protect loyalty, kinship, and the sanctity of those she loved. Her symbols reflected her liminality, standing between worlds. The moon, waxing and waning, was her crown. The boar was her justice, her independence, her refusal to be touched without consent. Deer and bears moved in her shadow, fierce and graceful, her companions as much as her weapons. She was as untamable as the wild itself. To the Greeks, Artemis embodied both fear and aspiration. She represented the life untouched by corruption, a freedom mortals longed for but rarely achieved. Yet she also embodied the price of that freedom solitude, vigilance, the constant need to defend boundaries. Her vow of chastity wasn't only personal, it was symbolic of her refusal to be claimed, her insistence that autonomy was worth any sacrifice. Imagine her walking under the moon, cloak pulled tight, the forest alive with the snap of twigs, the rush of night creatures. Where others might tremble, she moved with confidence. The night wasn't danger to her, it was her kingdom, and woe to anyone who mistook her silence for weakness. Her arrows never missed. Artemis's independence also made her a figure of fascination beyond myth. In a world where women were often bound by fathers, husbands, and sons, Artemis was untouchable. She was an ideal, a vision of freedom, even if it came with harsh edges. She offered a glimpse of what it meant to live without compromise, to answer only to oneself. That image lingered in her sanctuaries, where girls prepared for adulthood through rites that honored her. Before marriage, they dressed as bears in rituals at Broron, learning that power and independence were part of their identity too. But Artemis wasn't gentle with those who broke her trust. Orion, the great hunter, became her companion. Some say she loved him, though others deny it. But when he grew arrogant, boasting he would kill every beast on earth, Artemis sent a scorpion to strike him down. The stars carried them both, Orion the hunter and Scorpio the avenger, locked in the sky forever. Artemis couldn't allow arrogance to destroy the balance of her wilderness. Even companionship had its limits. What makes Artemis unforgettable is that she didn't bend. She was not the goddess of compromise. She was the goddess of boundaries drawn sharp, of independence defended with arrows, of freedom carried like a torch through the dark. That rigidity cost her tenderness. Yes, but it made her unshakable. In her, the Greeks saw both the wild beauty of the forest and the fear of being lost in it. She was the rustle in the branches that could mean a deer or death. She was the silver light that let you find your way or revealed you to predators. She was autonomy incarnate, and that autonomy demanded respect. So when her name is spoken, don't imagine only the huntress carved in marble, bow at her side, serene and distant. Imagine the cold moonlight on your skin as you walk alone in the woods, heart pounding, every sense alive. Imagine the relief when you realize the path is clear, the terror when you sense eyes watching from the dark. That is Artemis, the goddess who reminds us that freedom is exhilarating, but never safe. If Athena was the sharp edge of strategy, Ares was the blunt force of rage. He embodied the scream on the battlefield, the clash of shields, the stink of blood in the dirt. Where his sister calculated, he lunged. Where she sought order, he reveled in chaos. The Greeks feared him, tolerated him, but rarely honored him with love. They knew too well what he represented. Ares was the god of war in its rawest form, stripped of honor, stripped of meaning. His presence was felt in the moment the first spear pierced flesh, when the tide of battle drowned reason, when soldiers forgot why they fought and killed only because killing was easier than stopping. He was bloodlust, frenzy, the madness that overtakes armies. And unlike Athena, who was respected, Ares was despised, even among his own kin. Zeus himself often scorned him, calling him a disgrace, a necessary evil. That's telling even the king of gods saw in his son something shameful. Yet war is never absent, and so neither was Ares. Mortals called on him reluctantly, sacrificing black dogs at his altars, whispering his name not in reverence but in fear. They didn't want him near, but they couldn't pretend the battlefield didn't belong to him. His power surged when swords clashed and screams rose. He thrived where humanity tore itself apart. One of his most infamous myths shows the contempt he inspired. During the Trojan War, Ares took the side of Troy, driven not by justice but by whim, or perhaps by Aphrodite, who loved him. When he stormed into battle, Athena met him head-on. With the help of Diomedes, she guided a spear that pierced Ares' side. The god of war howled like 1,000 men in agony and fled to Olympus, bleeding and humiliated. Even among immortals, he could be wounded, and his retreat made him the butt of scorn. The Greeks relished this image, their own goddess of wisdom conquering the brute force of war. It was their philosophy written in myth, brains over brawn, strategy over chaos. But Ares was not entirely without allure. His affair with Aphrodite was legend, the union of lust and beauty, destruction and desire. They were caught in Hephaestus's golden net, exposed before all of Olympus, their humiliation ringing with laughter. And yet, mortals still whispered about them, because their union felt inevitable. Violence and passion, after all, often danced too close to each other. What made Ares terrifying wasn't his cunning. He had little but his relentlessness. He didn't stop. He didn't tire. On the battlefield, he was the embodiment of that soldier who keeps swinging even when his arm is broken, who charges into arrows as if death is nothing. That persistence is what makes war drag on longer than reason demands. And Ares fed on it, each drop of blood another spark in his furnace. Still, the Greeks saw him as a liability. Unlike Athena, who guided their victories, Ares was seen as foreign, wild, almost barbaric. His worship thrived more in Thrace, on the fringes of the Greek world, among tribes that glorified raw strength. In Athens, his image was restrained. The Areopagus, the hill of Ares, was not a battlefield but a court of law, where murder trials were judged. They sought to cage his spirit, to channel his chaos into justice. That tells you everything the Greeks feared what he represented and tried to bind him in laws. Yet the Romans saw him differently. They called him Mars and elevated him as a father of their people, through Romulus and Remus. They stripped away some of the shame and kept the glory. To them, war was not a frenzy but a tool of empire, and Mars became a god of disciplined strength. That shift shows how myth adapts. To the Greeks, Ares was danger. To the Romans, he was destiny. But peel back the stories, and Ares remains the same, a force of destruction that lives inside us all. He is the rage that blinds, the moment you slam your fist against the wall, the heat in your chest when reason falls away. He is intoxicating, dangerous, and real. We all carry a fragment of him, and that's why the Greeks couldn't ignore him, no matter how much they wanted to. There's something almost tragic about him. Ares longed for recognition, for respect equal to his siblings, yet he was constantly scorned. He fought endlessly, but victory never brought him dignity. He loved Aphrodite, but their love was a scandal. He was, in many ways, the eternal outsider, powerful, feared, but unloved. In that, he was closer to mortals than he realized. How many soldiers through history have been used, praised for their strength in the moment, only to be forgotten or discarded once the war was done? Ares embodied that cycle. Imagine him on a battlefield at dusk, armor dented, blood streaking his skin, eyes wild with fury. Around him, men scream, steel clashes, the air is thick with smoke. He grins, because this chaos is his element. But then the battle ends. The fires die down, the dead are counted, and Ares fades into silence. He thrives only in noise, in conflict. Without it, he is restless, empty, unwanted. That emptiness is his curse, and maybe that's the warning his myth carries. Rage can drive you forward, yes, but it burns out, leaving only ashes. Ares reminds us that unchecked fury doesn't build, it destroys. even the one who carries it. He is both intoxicating and hollow, both thrilling and terrifying. So when the Greeks told his stories, they didn't celebrate him. They endured him. They acknowledged that war was real, that blood was always near, but they also knew that war without wisdom leads only to ruin. Ares was their shadow, the reminder that chaos always lurks, waiting for the chance to spill into the world, and in that shadow, we can still see ourselves. The times we let anger take the wheel, the times we lash out and regret it, the times destruction feels easier than patience. That's Ares, walking with us. Not a god to adore, but a god to fear, the embodiment of the truth that sometimes the enemy is not outside, but within. If Ares was the chaos of war, Hephaestus was the order forged in fire. He was the craftsman of Olympus, the god with calloused hands, hammer ringing against an anvil deep in volcanic caverns, where his siblings embodied lightning, oceans, storms, and wisdom. Hephaestus embodied labour, the unseen force that built the weapons, palaces, and ornaments of immortality. He was not glamorous, not adored for beauty or charisma. He was the lame god, the one who limped across Olympus, mocked for his awkward form, yet indispensable for his genius. His story began with rejection. Some say Hera, disgusted by his deformity, cast him from Olympus herself. Others say Zeus hurled him down during a quarrel. Either way, Hephaestus landed in the sea, broken but alive, rescued by the sea goddesses Thetis and Eurynome. They raised him in secret, and there in the depths he began to shape metal. He didn't have marble halls or thunderbolts, but he had fire, stone, and will. His forge became his kingdom, his hammer his scepter. Out of pain, he made beauty. Out of exile, he forged power. That's the heart of Hephaestus' resilience. He was unwanted, discarded, yet he clawed his way into necessity. When he returned to Olympus, it wasn't because of pity, it was because the gods realized they needed him. The armor of Achilles, the chains that bound Prometheus, the throne of Zeus itself all bore his touch. Even the girdle of Aphrodite, shimmering with desire, was his creation. Without Hephaestus, Olympus would have been naked, yet his brilliance carried bitterness. He was married to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, but their union was cruel irony. She loved Ares, not him. Their affair was no secret, and Hephaestus endured the humiliation. But he wasn't powerless. He laid a trap, weaving a net of unbreakable chains, invisible until it fell. One day, as Aphrodite and Ares lay together, the net snapped shut, binding them in place. Hephaestus dragged them before the other gods, exposing their betrayal. The laughter of Olympus rang loud, mocking the lovers, mocking the lame god's revenge. Hephaestus had his justice, but justice rarely heals wounds. The marriage never found warmth. Still, Hephaestus endured. He didn't rule through beauty or thunder. He ruled through creation. When the Greeks imagined divine armor, it gleamed with his craft. The shield of Achilles was not just protection, it was a vision of the world itself, etched with cities at peace and cities at war, with constellations, with harvests. In his art, Hephaestus was philosopher as much as smith, capturing both the glory and the tragedy of existence. His forge burned in volcanoes, the hiss of molten metal rising with the smoke of Etna. Mortals who saw the glow of lava imagined his bellows at work. God's armor born in fire. Hephaestus blurred the line between divine and human, because mortals too knew the sting of labor, the dignity of work, the creation of beauty through pain. In him, they saw themselves the craftsman, the builder, the one who turned scars into strength. Unlike many Olympians, Hephaestus didn't meddle endlessly in mortal lives. He wasn't a schemer or a seducer, but his gifts shaped their destinies. Every hero carried something he had made. Perseus's sword, Heracles' breastplate, Achilles' armor, his touch turned men into legends. And when mortals crafted with skill, they honored him, the god who limped yet surpassed all others in precision. There is tragedy in his image. Imagine him at a feast, walking with difficulty, his body mocked by the very gods who relied on him. He sets down a goblet of gold, flawless, shimmering, and hears laughter behind his back. That was Hephaestus's existence, indispensable but never adored. And yet, maybe that's why he endures as one of the most relatable of the gods, who hasn't felt overlooked, undervalued, used for their skill but not loved for who they are. Hephaestus is the patron of those who endure humiliation and still create, of those who are cast out but return stronger. He is the god of resilience as much as fire. His limp was no weakness. It was proof that he survived what should have ended him. The Greeks respected him quietly. His worship was practical, tied to the craft of smiths and artisans. Unlike the wild festivals of Dionysus or the grand temples of Zeus, Hephaestus's sanctuaries were humble, smoky, filled with the sound of hammer and flame. But those sounds were sacred, just as much as hymns or prayers. They were hymns of survival, of transformation, and when the gods donned their gleaming armor, when their halls shone with golden thrones, they owed it all to the god they once threw away. That irony is sharp. Olympus mocked him, but Olympus was built on his back. So when you think of Hephaestus, don't picture just the lame god limping through marble halls. Picture the glow of a forge at midnight, sparks flying like stars, a figure bent over an anvil, sweat mingling with ash, shaping the world with every strike. Picture the man who turned pain into permanence, humiliation into power. He was not beautiful, he was not graceful, but he was enduring, and endurance, in the end, outlasts beauty and grace. If Hephaestus was the god who created beauty with fire and iron, Aphrodite was beauty itself, dangerous, disarming, irresistible. She didn't hammer weapons or forge armor. She didn't throw thunder or command the sea. Her power was subtler and far more consuming. She was the goddess of love, desire, and seduction. But her influence reached far beyond flirtation. She could topple kingdoms, ignite wars, and bend even gods to their knees. Her birth itself set her apart. Some said she rose from the sea foam, born of the severed genitals of Uranus, carried on the waves until she stepped onto the shore of Cyprus. Others claimed she was the daughter of Zeus and Dione, but whichever version one believed, she arrived not as an infant but as a fully grown woman, radiant, flawless, her very presence bending the air around her. From the start, she was the embodiment of longing, the ache in the chest that can't be reasoned away. Unlike Athena, who stood aloof, or Artemis, who guarded her independence with arrows, Aphrodite wove herself into every corner of mortal and divine life. Desire was not optional, it was inevitable. Men and women alike found themselves undone by it. Even the gods were not immune. Zeus himself, king of Olympus, was often swayed by her charm. To resist Aphrodite was to resist the beating of one's own heart. Few could manage it. Her marriage to Hephaestus was a cruel mismatch, arranged less out of love than out of convenience. She, the goddess of irresistible beauty, he the lame craftsman mocked by his kin. The contrast was sharp and the marriage cold. It was with Ares that she found her true passion destructive, consuming, illicit. Their affair was an open secret, whispered across Olympus, culminating in the scandal of Hephaestus's net. For all the humiliation, Aphrodite's allure never dimmed. If anything, the scandal only magnified her power. Desire, after all, thrives in defiance. Her influence stretched far beyond Olympus. The judgment of Paris stands as one of her most infamous victories, when Eris, goddess of strife, tossed the golden apple inscribed to the fairest into the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. To settle the dispute, Paris, a Trojan prince, was chosen as judge. Hera offered power, Athena wisdom, but Aphrodite offered the most dangerous gift of all love. She promised him Helen, the most beautiful mortal woman alive. Paris chose her, and that choice unraveled Troy. It was Aphrodite's whisper, her promise, that lit the spark of the Trojan War. Thousands would die, empires would fall, all because desire bends reason until it breaks. And yet, Aphrodite wasn't only the goddess of lust and betrayal, she was also the goddess of bonds, of intimacy that softened hearts and built families. She presided over weddings, over the union of husband and wife, over the gentle touch between parent and child. She was warmth as much as fire, connection as much as obsession. Her power was double-edged. It could heal loneliness, or it could destroy through longing. Her children reflected that duality. From her union with Ares came Eros, the mischievous god of love, whose arrows could make mortals fall helplessly, foolishly in love. From other unions came Phobos fear and Deimos terror, reminders that passion and dread often walk together. Love was never simple, and Aphrodite embodied all its contradictions. Mortals adored her. Temples rose in her name, especially in Cyprus and Corinth. In Corinth, her worship was said to include sacred prostitution, where desire itself became ritual. For the Greeks, honouring Aphrodite meant acknowledging that love and lust were as holy as any law or thunderbolt. She was not a goddess to be ignored. Her absence left life hollow. Her presence made it dangerous. What made Aphrodite unforgettable was her refusal to be contained. She wasn't just a patron of sweet romance. She was the force that drove people to risk everything, to betray oaths, to start wars, to endure humiliation. She was the quiet glance across a room that rearranged destinies. She was the hunger that made kings foolish and soldiers reckless. She was the reminder that humans and gods alike are never ruled by logic alone. Imagine her at the heart of Olympus, draped in silk, laughter on her lips, every eye drawn to her whether they wanted to or not. Even Athena, armed with wisdom, and Hera, crowned with dignity, could not eclipse her. They had to fight her on different terms because her power was the oldest and most primal of all. No strategy, no law, no dignity could erase desire. It lived in everyone, and Aphrodite was its face. And yet she wasn't untouchable. When her son Aeneas fought at Troy, she rushed to protect him, but was wounded by Diomedes. The sight of the goddess bleeding shocked the battlefield. Even beauty could be hurt. Even desire could falter. She fled, humiliated, and the Greeks laughed. But the laughter didn't last, because once the war ended, once the fire faded, who returned to shape new stories, new romances, new betrayals? Aphrodite, always Aphrodite. Her legacy is not statues alone, though her likeness filled temples and homes. It is the enduring truth she embodied that love and desire rule us as surely as thunder rules the sky or the sea obeys the tide. Her myths remind us that longing can destroy us, but also that it is what makes life worth enduring. Without it, there is no art, no poetry, no heroism, no humanity. So when the Greeks spoke her name, they spoke not only of beauty but of danger, not only of lust but of connection. Aphrodite was the pulse in the chest, the quickened breath, the reckless choice, the soft hand, the war cry. She was all of it, inseparable, undeniable. And when we tell her stories today, what lingers is not just her face or her lovers, but the recognition that she was right. Love is the most dangerous, irresistible force in the world, and like Paris, like Helen, like Troy, we are all still under her spell. Hermes came into the world running. He was born at dawn in a cave on Mount Cylin, and by midday he was already walking, already scheming. By nightfall he had stolen Apollo's cattle. That was his nature, restless, clever, shameless. While most gods grew into their domains, Hermes seemed to have been born with his already fully formed. He was the god of travellers, merchants, thieves, shepherds, gamblers, even liars. He was the messenger of Olympus, the trickster with a smile that could disarm or deceive, and the one who guided souls into the underworld when their time came. What made Hermes dangerous wasn't brute force or divine thunder. It was speed of thought, speed of tongue, speed of hands that could untie knots before you even saw him move. He was the embodiment of motion, of transition, of the liminal spaces where rules are thin and opportunity thrives. To mortals, he was both blessing and curse, the god who could guard a traveller's path or rob them blind on the same road. That story of the stolen cattle reveals him perfectly. On the very day of his birth, Hermes crept out of his cradle, found Apollo's herd, and drove the animals backward to confuse their tracks, to hide their trail. He wrapped their hooves in bark, a trick so clever that even Apollo, god of prophecy, was baffled. When confronted, Hermes played innocent, swaddled in blankets, eyes wide as if he had never stepped out of the cave. Zeus himself had to intervene, and even he couldn't keep a straight face. Apollo, furious, demanded restitution, and Hermes, quick with his tongue, offered the lyre he had just invented from a tortoise shell. Apollo, charmed by the music, forgave him, That was Hermes turning theft into art, lies into gifts, mischief into diplomacy. The Greeks saw in him the spirit of commerce and negotiation, but also of theft and gamble. He was the god who whispered in the ear of traders striking deals, but also the one who gave thieves the courage to pick locks. He blurred lines, because lines were made to be crossed, in a world obsessed with order and hierarchy. Hermes was the reminder that loopholes exist, that cunning can bend even divine law. His role as messenger of the gods elevated him further. Winged sandals carried him across the earth and sky, caduceus in hand, slipping between worlds faster than thought. Zeus trusted him with secrets and errands, knowing that Hermes could go anywhere, unseen, unstoppable. When gods needed mortals punished, when messages needed to pass without delay, Hermes was their courier, but he wasn't a servant. He relished the role because it gave him access, freedom, and information. In any world, mortal or divine information is power. Hermes had more of it than anyone, yet Hermes wasn't only mischief. He was also psychopomp, guide of souls. When mortals died, their spirits wandered, confused, frightened. Hermes appeared, not with thunder or terror, but with calm. He led them down the shadowed path, across rivers, through gates, into Hades' realm. He was liminal even here, the god of thresholds, escorting mortals from life to death. That duality is striking. The same god who could trick you into giving up your last coin could also take your hand in your final moment and walk with you into eternity. His myths ripple with this balance of humour and gravitas. He tricked Argus, the 100-eyed giant, lulling him to sleep with music before slitting his throat to free Io. He helped Perseus on his quest against Medusa, gifting him his winged sandals and a curved blade. He whispered strategies, guided travellers, stirred mischief, yet always straddled the line between saviour and thief. Mortals loved him because he felt close to them. Zeus was distant thunder, Poseidon an unpredictable storm, Hades a silence they dreaded. Hermes was the god you might actually meet on the road, disguised as a stranger with quick eyes and quicker hands. He was the god of boundaries, but also of breaking them. His altars stood at crossroads, stone pillars with carved heads, reminders that at every turn in life, choice is a gamble, and he wasn't without humour. Hermes laughed often, played tricks even on his own kin, poked at pride until it cracked. He brought levity to Olympus, where too many gods drowned in their own egos. His laughter could diffuse a quarrel or deepen one, depending on his mood. He was chaos, but not the destructive kind of Ares. He was chaos that teased, that unsettled, that reminded you never to take yourself or your power too seriously. Yet beneath that playfulness lay sharp truth. Hermes represented the reality that life is negotiation, that survival often depends less on strength than on wit. Mortals understood this instinctively. A farmer could be robbed by a storm, a soldier could be cut down in battle, but a clever trader might talk his way out of ruin. Hermes was that cleverness sanctified, the divine trick of survival. Imagine him on a dusty road at dusk, cloak pulled tight, sandals flashing as he passes, eyes gleaming with secrets. He could be the stranger who shares bread with you, or the one who lifts the purse from your belt as he says goodbye. You wouldn't know until it was too late. But either way, you'd tell the story afterward, and Hermes would live on in your telling. That was his genius. He thrived not in temples alone, but in gossip, in rumours, in every whispered tale of a trick too clever to ignore. And maybe that's why Hermes endures. He is wit, speed, charm, deception, guidance, all the contradictions that make life unpredictable. He is the reminder that rules bend, that truth slips, that survival belongs not always to the strongest, but to the quickest. In Hermes, the Greeks saw themselves not as heroes or kings, but as people hustling, bartering, lying, laughing, and finding a way forward through a world that rarely played fair. So when his name was spoken, it wasn't with solemnity, but with a grin, with a nod to the chaos that lurks at every crossroad. Hermes was never about reverence. He was about recognition, the recognition that life is trickery. And trickery, if you're clever enough, might just be the most divine gift of all. Dionysus was the last to arrive among the Olympians, and maybe that's why he felt like the wild card no one could quite contain. Where the others carved out domains of order law, wisdom, sea, sky, Dionysus claimed the places where order unravelled. He was the god of wine, theatre, madness, ecstasy. He was celebration and terror bound together, a reminder that joy and destruction often drink from the same cup. His origins were already strange, a story stitched with contradiction. Zeus loved Semele, a mortal woman, and promised her anything she desired. But Hera whispered doubt into her ear, convincing her to ask Zeus to reveal himself in his full divine form. When he did, his thunder consumed her. Out of the ashes, Zeus saved the unborn child, sewing him into his thigh until the boy was ready to be born. So Dionysus entered the world not from a womb, but from lightning and flesh, twice born, stitched together from love and ruin. From the start, his existence defied categories. As he grew, he wandered, never quite fitting on Olympus at first. He travelled through Asia, teaching mortals the cultivation of vines, the mysteries of fermentation, the art of losing oneself in intoxication. But what he offered was never just wine, it was release. For peasants bent under labour, for women bound by rigid roles, for anyone carrying grief or rage, Dionysus offered escape. His festivals were not polite rituals but eruptions music, drums, dancing until exhaustion, masks that allowed mortals to shed themselves and become something more or less. But freedom carried danger. Those who resisted him often paid dearly. The story of Pentheus, king of Thebes, is one of his darkest lessons. Pentheus mocked Dionysus, calling his rites shameful, his followers mad. He tried to suppress the god's worship, to impose control where Dionysus promised release. The god answered not with thunder, but with theatre. He lured Pentheus into disguise, dressing him as a woman to spy on the Bacchic revels, inflamed by frenzy. The women mistook their king for a lion and tore him apart limb by limb. It wasn't just punishment. It was spectacle, a performance written in blood. Dionysus showed that to deny him was to be consumed by the very madness you feared, and yet, for all his savagery, he was also gentleness. He found Ariadne, abandoned on Naxos by Theseus, and made her his bride, lifting her from despair into the heavens. He offered comfort to the grieving, release to the weary, belonging to the outcast. His worshippers were women, slaves, foreigners, those pushed to the margins of Greek society. To them, Dionysus was liberation. In his rites, they were no longer defined by rank or role. They were divine, even if only for a night. The theatre became his temple. The Greeks built grand stages at the foot of the Acropolis, and every spring, plays were performed in his honour. Tragedy and comedy alike carried his spirit, because both revealed truths hidden beneath masks. Tragedy showed the cost of pride, the inevitability of suffering. Comedy exposed folly, mocked the powerful, reminded audiences that laughter too can wound and heal. Dionysus was in both the unmasking of humanity, the tearing down of illusions. He was also a god of contradiction. He could bring joy, but his joy bordered on mania. He could bring freedom, but freedom without limits becomes chaos. He blurred the line between god and mortal, sanity and madness, ecstasy and terror. And that blur is what made him so irresistible. He embodied what humans craved, but also feared the chance to lose themselves, to dissolve into something larger than their own fragile skin. The Greeks called him Eleutherios, the liberator, but they also called him Liaios, the loosener of grief, and Bromios, the roaring one. Each name captured a side of him: comfort, freedom, violence. He was never one thing, never predictable. Where Zeus enforced order, Dionysus dissolved it. Where Athena demanded control, Dionysus shattered it. Where Apollo sought clarity, Dionysus embraced ambiguity. They were opposites, yet inseparable. The Greeks saw them as twin forces, the rational and the ecstatic, the balance that keeps life human. Imagine his arrival in a village at dusk. Drums already pounding, torches flickering, women with ivy in their hair, men staggering with cups of wine, laughter and sobs tangled together. In the centre, Dionysus himself, crowned with vines, eyes burning with joy and danger. He dances, and the crowd follows, until they are no longer themselves but a single body, pulsing, trembling, free. That was his gift, and his threat. He broke down the walls that kept people apart, but he also broke down the walls that kept them safe. Mortals both feared and longed for him. To deny him was to risk Pentheus's fate. To embrace him was to surrender control. Either way, you could not ignore him. His cult spread across Greece, resisted at first, but always winning converts, because in every heart there is something that longs to break free, to escape the weight of reason, to be lost in ecstasy if only for a moment. And in that way, Dionysus was the most human of the gods. He wasn't distant thunder or cold wisdom. He was the pulse of the drum, the taste of wine, the madness of grief, the sweetness of love found in despair. He was contradiction made divine, and contradiction is the essence of being alive. The Romans would later call him Bacchus, and his festivals became infamous for excess. But for the Greeks, he was more than drunkenness. He was catharsis. He was the recognition that life is unbearable without moments of release, that without breaking down, we cannot rebuild. So when the Greeks built their theatres, when they drank deep in his festivals, they weren't just worshipping a god. They were admitting a truth that beneath all order and reason, we are fragile, restless, aching for release. Dionysus gave them permission. And though his laughter could turn to a roar, though his embrace could end in frenzy, they followed him anyway, because he promised something no other god could: freedom, even if it came at the edge of madness. Olympus was not a palace of harmony. It was a court, a gathering place where every god brought their pride, their grudges, their hungers. Imagine a grand hall gleaming with marble, thrones lined in gold, and yet the air so heavy with rivalry you could cut it like cloth. This was no serene heaven. This was politics elevated to immortality, a drama that never ended because the players never aged, never died, and never forgave. Zeus sat at the centre, Thunderbolt at his side, pretending that his authority was absolute. Hera, seated beside him, carried her dignity like a weapon, her gaze cutting across the hall like polished steel. Athena stood to one side, her expression calm but calculating. Poseidon leaned forward in his seat, trident at his feet, his eyes flashing whenever thunder cracked above, as if reminding everyone that he had not forgotten his second-place lot. Hades rarely visited, preferring the silence of his underworld, but when he appeared the air chilled, and even Zeus's booming laughter softened. Around them gathered the rest, Apollo radiant with his lyre, Artemis with her bow across her lap, Ares smouldering, Hephaestus bent and silent, Aphrodite radiant and restless, Hermes whispering at the edges, and Dionysus laughing too loudly with a cup always half full. The hall was a council, but it was also a battlefield of words. Debates over mortals spilled like wine. Should this city rise? Should that one fall? Should a king be punished? Should a hero be rewarded? Zeus claimed to rule with law, but law was a shifting thing, bent by persuasion, bribed by charm, reshaped by grudges. Hera reminded him of oaths. Athena argued for justice. Poseidon thundered for vengeance. Decisions weren't made with order, they were wrestled from chaos. Consider the trial of Prometheus. He had stolen fire and given it to mortals, a theft that threatened divine monopoly. Zeus wanted chains, eternal punishment. Hephaestus forged the bonds, reluctant but obedient. Hermes delivered the sentence with a flicker of unease. Only Athena hesitated, seeing in the Titans' defiance something that echoed their own rebellion against Cronus. Yet the council followed Zeus, and Prometheus was shackled. Even in agreement, there were fractures, unspoken alignments, silent sympathies, resentments tucked away like daggers. Or take the rebellion against Zeus himself. Hera, weary of humiliation, conspired with Poseidon and Athena. They drugged the king, bound him in unbreakable chains. For a brief, breathless moment, Olympus shifted queen, sea, and wisdom united. But the 100-handed Briareus intervened. Breaking the bonds, Zeus rose, wrathful, punishing Hera, threatening Poseidon, and glaring at Athena with a father's fury. The rebellion failed, but its memory lingered. Every council afterward carried the echo of that night, a reminder that even the throne could tremble. Alliances were fragile. Apollo and Artemis, twin children of Leto, often stood together, their unity a shield in disputes. Ares and Aphrodite, scandalous in love, defended each other with stubbornness that made others roll their eyes. Hermes drifted between sides, sometimes carrying words, sometimes twisting them, always leaving confusion in his wake. Dionysus, half welcome and half feared, shifted the room with his laughter, turning solemn arguments into absurd theatre. He was unpredictable, which in Olympus made him powerful. The court was more than words. It was spectacle. Feasts blurred into debates, debates into quarrels, quarrels into fights that split the sky. Mortals down below saw lightning storms, earthquakes, floods, and thought them natural. They were not. They were consequences of divine egos colliding, the fallout of immortal pride. A mortal army could march for years, but one argument on Olympus could erase it overnight. Even their banquets dripped with politics. Hephaestus's golden cups passed hand to hand, each sip an acknowledgement of his craft. Aphrodite's smile could tilt loyalties, her glance igniting arguments between those foolish enough to believe it meant more than it did. Athena rarely touched her wine, her sobriety itself a kind of statement. Ares drank deep, his temper rising with every swallow. Zeus roared with laughter one moment and thundered with rage the next, while Hera sipped in silence, every drop masking calculation. Nothing was casual. Every gesture, every word, every silence was part of the performance. Mortals often imagined Olympus as perfection, but the truth was closer to their own courts, flawed, political, unstable. The only difference was scale. A mortal king might destroy a city in anger. An Olympian could ruin an entire civilization. The gods' grudges weren't just family feuds, they were history, carved into the world itself. The Trojan War showed this clearly. Olympus split into factions, each god choosing sides. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon favored the Greeks. Aphrodite, Ares, and Apollo fought for Troy. Zeus pretended neutrality but tilted the balance whenever it suited him. The war wasn't just mortal ambition, it was divine rivalry played out through human flesh. When Achilles raged, when Hector fell, when Troy burned, Olympus was watching, arguing, betting, shaping. The court of gods was not above war, it was war's true architect. And yet, beneath the chaos, there was unity of a strange kind. The gods needed each other. Without Hephaestus, their halls would crumble. Without Apollo, their festivals would be silent. Without Hermes, their messages lost. Without Athena, their strategies flawed. Even Ares, despised as he was, brought the raw power of fear that reminded mortals who ruled them. They mocked, they fought, they betrayed, but they also circled back, drawn together by immortality's curse. Eternity is long, and even hatred needs company. Imagine standing in that hall, watching them argue, laugh, threaten, scheme. It wouldn't feel holy. It would feel human, magnified 1,000 times. The same insecurities, the same pride, the same hunger for recognition, all wrapped in divine brilliance. That was Olympus's secret. It was less about divinity and more about humanity without limits. And maybe that's why the Greeks told their stories this way. If their gods had been flawless, distant, perfect, they would have been irrelevant. But flawed gods proud, jealous, ambitious, those gods mattered. Those gods explained the storms and the wars, the betrayals and the victories. Olympus was not a sermon about morality. It was a mirror, tilted toward the sky, reflecting human chaos in immortal light. So when lightning cracked across the horizon, when the sea surged, when fate twisted lives into tragedy, mortals didn't just blame chance. They pictured that hall on Olympus, filled with gods shouting over one another, their quarrels spilling down like fire. And perhaps, in the quiet after the storm, they whispered the truth that the gods above weren't so different after all. When the noise of Olympus spilled into the mortal world, it was not just thunder or earthquakes, it was memory, carved into generations. The gods had their palace, but their shadows stretched across every valley, every battlefield, every whispered prayer in the dark. And as centuries passed, their legacy became less about what they did in their golden hall, and more about how mortals chose to remember them. Legends lingered in the cracks of ruined temples, in the stones worn by countless hands touching them for luck. Farmers still poured wine onto the earth for Dionysus, hoping their vines would not rot. Women in childbirth still muttered Artemis's name under their breath, afraid to speak too loud lest the goddess hear and decide otherwise. Sailors still tied knots in their ropes and called to Poseidon before pushing off the shore. Even as empires rose and fell, the Olympians remained embedded in the living rhythm of humanity. But their legacy was not soft, it was fractured, complex, sometimes cruel. Take Ares, for example. Few prayed to him openly, but in every war, every clash of spears, his presence returned. His name became less of a prayer and more of an inevitability where men fought. Ares walked. His worship was fear, and fear does not fade easily. Generals carved his name into their armor, not to call him, but to acknowledge him. Soldiers spat it under their breath, as if to rid themselves of his grip. Ares didn't need temples. Battlefields were his altars. Athena's name endured differently. Cities rose in her honor, the Parthenon gleaming with her presence, her olive tree rooted in their soil. Her worship was not fear, but aspiration. Humans wanted to believe wisdom and strategy could guide them, even if they rarely lived up to that ideal. Philosophers invoked her as they debated under starlight. Sculptors invoked her discipline in every careful chisel. For every soldier who feared Ares, there was a citizen who prayed for Athena, and then there was Aphrodite. She lingered not in temples alone, but in every stolen glance, every betrayal, every marriage bet. Her name was whispered in passion and spat in jealousy. The Greeks never really abandoned her, because they couldn't. Desire is inescapable. Even when her statues crumbled, her power lived on in every heart that broke for love. The gods were not abstractions. They were human instincts magnified until they shook the world. They survived not because they were immortal, but because they were relatable. Mortals looked up at Olympus and saw themselves angrier, pettier, more powerful, but still themselves. That recognition was the hook that bound stories to memory. But here's the irony: even as the Olympians thundered and schemed, mortals began to question. Philosophers like Xenophanes looked at the myths and saw absurdity. If horses could paint gods, he said, they would look like horses. Others wondered why gods lied, cheated, and killed as much as men. Slowly, the myths that bound cities began to fracture under the weight of reason. The Olympians weren't fading yet, but their grip was loosening. Rome would inherit them, reshape them, rename them. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars. Some grew greater in that translation. Mars was honored where Ares was despised. Others dimmed. But the essence remained, because the human need to explain chaos, love, war, and death remained. The gods were masks, shifting with each culture, but beneath the masks the faces were the same. Still, for the Greeks themselves, legacy was never tidy. Ask one city about Hera, and you'd hear of her sanctuaries and protection of marriage. Ask another, and you'd hear of her vengeance and cruelty. Ask a soldier about Poseidon, and he might tell you about a safe voyage. Ask a farmer, and he might curse his name for a ruined harvest. The gods were contradictions because life was contradiction. Their legacy was not carved in stone, it was argued, debated, sung, and feared, all at once. And the greatest irony of all for being so immortal, they depended entirely on mortals to remember them. Without worship, without stories, they would have been nothing but fading echoes. It was the offerings, the plays, the poems, the whispered prayers that fed them. The gods ruled, but the people sustained their thrones. Picture a festival in Athens at its height. The city thrums with noise, sacrifices rise in smoke. Actors on the stage perform tragedies that make the audience weep behind every mask. Dionysus smiles on every column of the temple. Athena's shadow stretches in every cheer. Zeus hears an echo of loyalty. This was legacy in motion, gods and mortals bound in ritual, each reflecting the other, but legacy is fragile. Centuries later, when Christianity spread, the Olympians began to fade into memory. Their temples cracked, their festivals outlawed, their names whispered not as prayers but as cautionary tales, and yet they never vanished. Even stripped of altars, they survived in stories, in art, in the very language of humanity. Aphrodite lived on in the word aphrodisiac. Echo still whispers in the hills. Narcissus still bends over the water. Their legacies mutated, but they endured. For the Greeks, though, their legacy was a warning. The gods taught that power is never secure, that pride is always punished, that even immortals cannot escape their flaws. They reminded mortals that chaos is always near, that love can destroy as easily as it creates, that wisdom is never free from cruelty. The gods were not moral teachers, they were mirrors. And so, when storms broke over the Aegean, when crops failed, when wars dragged on, mortals didn't just see misfortune. They saw the faces of the gods they knew so well, and in that recognition was a strange comfort. If even the mighty were flawed, then perhaps their own struggles were part of the same pattern. Olympus thundered above, but the true legacy was below in the hearts and minds of those who told the stories again and again, reshaping them for each new generation. That's how immortality works. Not by avoiding death, but by refusing to be forgotten. Yet the legacy of the Olympians did not end with fading temples or silent altars. Their stories seeped into the bones of the Western world, shaping how humans imagined power, love, vengeance, wisdom, and folly. Even as faith shifted, the myths clung like ivy to the stones of abandoned sanctuaries, refusing to let go. And in the quiet, in the gaps where belief once burned hot, the gods transformed into symbols, archetypes that outlasted belief itself. Zeus, the thunderer, became the eternal warning about hubris and authority. Every king who seized too much, every dictator who claimed the world as his right, carried Zeus's shadow. His thunderbolts echoed in cannon fire, in the crack of artillery, in the roar of engines built to dominate. And each time, history reminded us of the same truth: power held through fear is fragile. Cronus fell to Zeus. Zeus himself lived paranoid of his children. And mortals, looking back, saw in that paranoia a mirror of their own rulers. The gods had become metaphors, their immortality surviving not in the sky but in the ways humans explained their own world. Hera endured as the archetype of dignity tested by betrayal. Her fury lived on in every story of a scorned queen, every drama where loyalty was broken, every whispered tale of vengeance sharpened by humiliation. She was not merely the goddess of marriage, she was the emblem of resilience, the reminder that pride and pain often walk hand in hand. And mortals carried her image forward, sometimes vilifying her, sometimes admiring her, but always remembering her. Poseidon became more than waves and earthquakes. He became the personification of resentment, of restless hunger for acknowledgement. His trident gleamed in naval banners, in the dreams of empires that sought to rule the seas. But his stories carried a warning too that oceans can't be controlled, that resentment always finds its storm. Sailors whispered his name even when they no longer believed, because the sea itself was proof of him beautiful, dangerous, untamable. Hades remained steady, the most unchanging of all. Long after his temples fell silent, people still imagined the underworld. They renamed it, redefined it, but the structure remained gates, rivers, judges, punishments, fields of rest. His helm of invisibility became the idea of death itself, unseen until it arrives. Unlike Zeus or Poseidon, Hades didn't need worship to endure. Mortality itself was his altar, and every grave carved in stone was his shrine. Athena thrived where reason and strategy were honoured. Philosophers took her name when they built schools of thought, generals when they devised tactics, artisans when they shaped order from chaos. Even in eras where her temples crumbled, her olive branch remained a symbol of peace, her owl a symbol of wisdom. In every library, in every courtroom, in every city that sought to rule by reason instead of chaos, Athena's spirit lingered. Apollo, radiant and cruel, lived on in every artist who believed beauty could reveal truth, and in every tyrant who twisted truth into cruelty. His lyre became the music that soothes and provokes. His prophecies became the riddles of history that mortals never fully understand. Every sunrise carried his name, even when no one spoke it. Every epidemic reminded people of his arrows. Every song hummed in darkness carried his echo. Artemis, untamed, refused to fade. She was the wilderness itself, the moon overhead, the call of independence that no law could erase. Women who sought freedom remembered her. Hunters who moved through forests felt her in the silence between breaths. Every time someone looked at the moon and felt both comfort and unease, Artemis was there, not in temples but in instinct. Ares never became beloved, but he never disappeared either. His name changed. His symbols shifted. But war never left. And so neither did he. Every soldier charging into battle with rage in their chest, every warlord who glorified bloodshed, every battlefield soaked in red, these were his monuments. Where Athena guided strategy, Ares embodied the chaos that strategy cannot erase. His immortality was carved into the endless cycle of human conflict. Hephaestus endured in the hammering of blacksmiths, in the smoke of factories, in the brilliance of engineers. He was never glamorous, but he was always necessary. In every spark of invention, in every scarred hand that built something lasting, he lived. The lame god, mocked by his kin, became the eternal emblem of resilience, proof that beauty and power are often born from pain. Aphrodite needed no temples to survive. Love itself kept her alive. She lived in every kiss, every betrayal, every reckless choice driven by longing. She thrived in poetry, in art, in the ache of desire that no society has ever suppressed. When Troy burned for Helen, it was her hand that lit the torch, and when lovers across centuries whispered promises in the dark, it was her voice that lingered in the silence. Hermes continued in every crossroads, every gamble, every deal struck with a handshake and a lie. He was the patron of hustlers, travellers, merchants, thieves, tricksters. His winged sandals became the symbol of speed, his caduceus a symbol of commerce and medicine alike. He was too clever to die. As long as humans told stories of survival through wit, Hermes would grin in the margins, and Dionysus, perhaps the most enduring of all, never faded. His spirit lived in theatre, in music, in every moment where order gave way to ecstasy. When crowds lost themselves in dance, when actors wore masks on stage, when grief dissolved in laughter or wine, Dionysus was present. He was madness, but also release. And humanity would always need release. But legacy is not just survival. It is transformation. The Olympians ceased to be gods in whom people placed their daily prayers. Instead, they became archetypes, threads woven into culture, art, philosophy, even psychology. They stopped ruling from Olympus and started ruling from the human mind. The Renaissance sculptors carved them again in marble, not as deities to be feared, but as ideals of beauty and power. Poets resurrected them as metaphors, playwrights as characters, painters as symbols. Freud reimagined Oedipus. Jung spoke of archetypes rooted in gods and myths. The Olympians were reborn, not as rulers of the sky, but as rulers of imagination. And perhaps this is the truest immortality, not the endless continuation of the same throne, the same quarrels, the same lightning bolts, but the ability to evolve, to adapt, to slip into new masks with each generation. The Greeks carved them one way, the Romans another, the Renaissance another still. Today they appear in novels, in films, in songs, in the quiet metaphors we use without even knowing their origin. When we call someone a narcissist, when we describe an Achilles heel, when we speak of Herculean strength, we are invoking the Olympians, unthinking, casual, yet still feeding their eternity. And beneath all of it lies a deeper truth: the gods were never just about belief. They were about storytelling. They survived because humans need stories to make sense of chaos, to explain storms and wars, love and death, joy and grief. The Olympians gave faces to instincts, names to forces, narratives to fears, and even when belief faded, the need for stories did not. That's why they linger still. Picture it now, Olympus, its marble cracked, its thrones abandoned, the feasts gone silent, and yet, in every city, every home, every whispered bedtime story, their voices stir again. Zeus's thunder echoes in the fury of storms. Hera's pride burns in the resilience of the betrayed. Athena's wisdom breathes in every calculated move. Dionysus laughs in every drunken song. They are not gone. They have only shifted into the places we least expect them. And perhaps that is their final legacy. Not gods above, but gods within. They are us magnified, our flaws and strengths stretched until they become mythic. When we tell their stories, we are really telling our own: the hunger for power, the longing for love, the sting of jealousy, the necessity of wisdom, the ache for freedom, the madness of grief, the joy of release. The Olympians endure because they are not alien. They are human nature, eternal and unyielding, dressed in divine form. So when the world feels chaotic, when power corrupts, when desire blinds, when wisdom falters, when rage consumes, when release becomes necessary, the old stories whisper again. They remind us that none of this is new, that long before us, the gods themselves struggled with the same chaos, and if they could not conquer it, maybe we don't have to either. Maybe it is enough to live it, to endure it, to tell the stories and pass them on. The thrones of Olympus may be empty, the feasts may be gone, but as long as humanity dreams, fears, desires, and tells stories, the gods are not dead. They're sitting quietly in the back of our minds, waiting for the moment when thunder rolls, when the sea crashes, when love ignites, when laughter breaks the silence. Then they rise again, not as rulers, but as reminders.